Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Leveraging Supplier Relationships to Drive Resilience. Today's presentation is going to be a little different than our APQC norm in a more panel discussion. So as you see, audio is available through your computer lines or dial-in speakers, and all attendees are muted. To ask a question, we'll have two different options. Submit your questions using the Q&A panel to the right of your screen, or use the raise your hand feature to ask your question live. We will address questions during the presentation, and you'll receive a recording via email within a few days. I would now like to pass the presentation off to Marisa Brown, APQC Senior Principal Research Lead.
Thanks so much, Madison, and thank you everyone for joining us today. In looking at 2021, I conducted a survey to find out what are everyone's top priorities for supply chain for this year. And not surprisingly, results were quite different than they were for the year before. But one thing that was consistent is that sourcing and procurement has been in the top 1 or 2 priorities for organizations for the past several years. And one of the things we saw is that 79% of organizations say it's a focus for 2021. And within sourcing and procurement, the #1 focus is supplier relationship management. So to talk more about that and really look at supplier relationship management for 2021 specifically, I thought I would bring together some of the leading minds on strategic supplier relationships. So I have joining me today 2 longtime friends of APQC. First, we have Kate Vitasek. Kate is faculty for graduate and executive education at the University of Tennessee, and also the lead researcher for the vested model. And we've got Bonnie Keith. Bonnie is the founder of the Forefront Group, and also she and Kate together co-authored Strategic Sourcing in the New Economy, a fabulous book we have a link to at the end if you haven't checked it out before. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and start the conversation. So today, we're going to be discussing things in an informal way, and I do encourage you, as Madison said, to submit some questions to us. And we'll actually even give you the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask them live. But first, Kate, why don't you start us off with your take on how you think supply chains and strategic supplier relationships changed in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? And then Bonnie, would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Well, great. Well, you know, everybody, the pandemic's no longer new. It's a year old now. And I know I quit traveling. My last day of traveling was March 14th. So it's officially over a year. You know, I think the supply chain and any weaknesses we had came back and bit us, right? So if we didn't have good relationships and now there's a shortage of supplies, you know, how do you actually work with your suppliers to rationalize that? And if you weren't in good light with your supplier, if you were all about, you know, price, beat you up and didn't have relationships, you probably got left in the dust with COVID. And so I think, you know, having tracked your surveys now for several years, I'm a huge fan of the work you guys do. Procurement and supplier relationship management have been rising over time, right? So there's been this recognition, and I think COVID kind of put the panic attack in everyone going, holy smokes, you know, I'm hosed without my good suppliers. And so it really shed this, put the spotlight on the fact that we need, it's not just a nice thing to say, it's not just the initiative of the year, but, you know, we really need to invest in these mechanisms to have good relationships with our suppliers. You know, I say P&G has 80,000 suppliers. They can't all be strategic. They can't all, you know, be there. So how are you segmenting your suppliers so that you are bringing out the best in those supplier areas where you do have the biggest risk, and you do need to purposely and intentionally foster these better relationships?
I would say when you talk about segmenting also, what we would say is it's not just purely segmenting according to price or quantity impact. It is on business impact. And sometimes what you think is sort of a run-of-the-mill commodity type item is not, because it has actually a huge impact, or something that you might not think about at all. And COVID brought this out in spades, clearly, because things like, oh dear, even in Texas recently, for those of you who might be in Texas, right, the utility grid went haywire, right, this winter. Well, guess what? There are lots and lots of supply sources, manufacturers in Texas who were actually bitten by the fact that there was a problem in the grid. But in addition to that, not only did it affect their business for a time being, but their recovery rate, even from that now, has changed their entire focus on how they're even going to increase their relationship with just pure, what I would call utility services suppliers, something that you don't hear about normally. I mean, Kate and I have been working with lots of industries over the years, and some of it's invested. Certainly, we've had other exposures. And who would have thought that COVID would have a rippling effect on the utility grid in a state that has a rippling effect on major suppliers who now feel like, oh, wait a minute, I've done my strategy, my segmentation. I didn't think too much about utilities as being a supplier relationship that I have to look at. And now it's absolutely in the top 6 of one of the key resources sitting in the great state of Texas in a global supply company. So it is amazing how this has just rippled. And with them, they were kind of, actually, if you think about it, you're actually captured by your utility provider. But even with that, they're coming back saying, oh, wait a minute, we need to think about the strategy and how we approach the utilities so that we can have what? Supply resistance, right? Resilience, and be able to get this action in place so that we're not impacted so severely. And it's not just price, in that case. So that's one where you can't even commoditize it because you're a captured audience, right? So that's an example of the rippling effect, not only from what we might consider basic supplies and services, but here's a really big service that actually has surfaced as a result of relationship mismatch, frankly. Yeah?
Yeah, Marisa, who'd ever thought, a supply chain person would be keynoting a utility association conference, and I'm actually on their docket for their next conference. It's like, maybe we need to put this front and center. So, I was glad Ronnie brought up that, because anywhere you have risk, and it's not just the classic, Kraljic matrix 2x2, but there's lots of factors that we need to look at. And I think this is where procurement has really, simplified into this 2x2 or the AT Kearney 64 checkerboard. We're using tactics instead of being really strategic about how we think about these relationships, and we need to step back.
Yeah.
Great point. And you're right. As someone in Texas, I keenly felt the problems we had recently with the utilities.
Yeah.
So when you think about the fact that it's like COVID is now a year old and we had this freeze that affected things, we recently had a ship stuck in the Suez Canal. Obviously, we will continue to experience disruptions in our supply chains. So what do you think companies and industries should do with their strategic suppliers to better prepare for the next disruption? What lessons can they learn from what they've been through to do a better job next time?
Well, the first thing out of my mind was that they need to acknowledge the value that any supplier relationship can bring you. And when I say value, I'm not talking about price value. I'm talking about the total package here. Well, like I said, when we talk about supplier segmentation, not every supplier relationship is created equal, nor should it be. But if you think about what the supplier relationship or the supplier itself can provide you in terms of value and the impact on your business, and this isn't necessarily a price tag in every case, that's where you start to think differently. Would you have a different relationship with somebody, a year ago or 14 months ago, when you found out that your business was going to come to a halt because the contract you had was pure price or performance based, right? Transactional or performance based. And if you were to fall on the contract document, there would be no legal recourse. So we tend to look at legal, when in fact, quite frankly, it's those companies, even in spite of their contracts, who had started to develop a more collaborative relationship, started to understand the value of this combination of resources and the supply base with their company, who actually fared better. That the supplier, in spite of what the contractual document said, pulled out unique solutions to keep their client base in operation and moving forward. And I think that is a critical component. It's the value component, not just the price.
Yeah,
Great.
I mean, Marisa, business is dynamic, right? Business happens, as I like to say. And so if it's not the pandemic this year, it's the Suez Canal, it's the Texas grid, whatever. Business happens. And so I think that more than ever, we're realizing that we need flexibility, right? So we can buy a widget or a unit of service or whatever, right? But we have to look beyond the widget or the janitor if we're buying facilities management, whatever it is. And Bonnie used the term value, but one of the key value components is this flexibility and the relationship itself. So we're huge advocates of creating what we coin as a formal relational contract. We've written about it in an HBR article called The New Approach to Contracts. So on these, very strategic relationships where you do have risk and you do need collaboration to help you, dig out of the hole or prevent some of these things that you've done, put that relationship front and center. And so what you're buying isn't just the thing, but you're buying the relationship and the governance structures that package around that, so that when things happen, you have the governance structures in place to react quickly, right? So you're buying that flexibility and the governance mechanisms to help you react.
So Kate, I know that you've been researching these contracts, both of you have, and I know you've got the new book coming out even on contracting in the new economy. So do you think, it sounds like contracts were hindering some organizations when the last big pandemic hit. I like to call it the last one as opposed to the current one. But how do you think that they can build these strategic relationships through better contracting processes? And what are the biggest barriers to making that happen?
Right, so that's a great point, right? So even if we say strategic partner, right, we're saying this, or we're saying we're going to put SRM, those things are today held outside the contract. And we think that's a flaw, right? So I need you to be strategic. I need this governance. I need, I'm going to put in SRM. I want you to work with me. But then you turn around and look at the contract. And when organizations are under stress, right, what's the contract say? So Oliver Hart won a Nobel Prize for his work. He's an economist out of Harvard University for his concepts on incomplete contracts and contracts as a reference point. So no matter how hard we try, the more strategic we are, the more complex things are, your contracts are incomplete. They're imperfect. So there will be gaps, there will be errors, there will be omissions. And so we write these rigid contracts. We want everything to be perfect, right? So the lawyers get in there and they write these perfect contracts and it sets an expectation, yet business happens and there's a crack. There's a loophole, something happens, and we aren't coupling that with the mechanisms on how do we deal with it. And so we're an advocate that you have a contracting process. It's not just about the words on the paper and you negotiate, the price for the widget or whatever, but you're actually putting the relationship front and center, and you're negotiating the constructs of the relationship and the partnership. So you have what it is you're trying to achieve, right? So flexibility is important. You're gonna not just buy the widget, but flexibility. So you want to add that in, and you want to have guiding principles so that when business happens, how do we go back and what are the 6 things that are going to guide us to make good decisions? And then you want to couple that with your governance structure. And And I love the work, and we've collaborated with APQC on SRM stuff, right? And I think a lot of the things that people have done around SRM it's good. Don't get me wrong, I love it. But it's really thinking about the supplier relationship management. I'm managing the supplier, and it's one way. And to be successful, these relationships are two-way. And so we want people to slow down and not just say SRM, but strategic relationship management for these more strategic deals, the ones that can really, upset the apple cart on your supply chain, and embed those mechanisms, those governance mechanisms into the contract. They're not something that's on the side that just is nice. Governance isn't free. And so, it costs a supplier, and the more complex we are, the more risky we are, the more we need better governance. And so let's put that front and center and create these formal relational contracts. And that's the whole premise behind the HB article and our latest book, Contracting the New Economy. Yes, you're buying a widget, you're buying the transaction, but when you write a contract that's transactional in nature, it misses the boat on so much of the beauty of what makes these things work.
The interesting thing, just to build on that a little bit, is not only do you want to include the two-way relationship and you embed it in the process of contracting and think about the relationship beyond just the typical or traditional way we contract and manage risk, by incorporating governance, by incorporating the relational components, you immediately start to melt away that risk. And we see it over and over again. We start down a pathway between two parties who say, oh, we want to have the best relationship. We want to be collaborative. And then you ask them, well, what are the limits? What are the boundaries? We call them guardrails. But what are these boundaries that you want to put in place? Well, we get a shopping list, that could be on a legal size piece of paper. And we said, no, you're telling us that you want to walk away from this relationship if this laundry list of things isn't adhered to. And so they immediately miss it. And then when we start to talk about the relational intents, the behaviors, the way they want to work together and what they need to do to get to that collaborative mindset, to get to the point where they govern together in a smart way, eventually that laundry list gets down to, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 things maybe, and the risk melts away. So the key point here that I want to build on what Kate said is, not only you're managing and you're using this process to contract for the broader relationship, but you're also through that process, through the natural focus on the relationship and how you're going to manage and interact together, you're actually eliminating a lot of those risk factors that the lawyers, and I'm sure there are lawyers on this broadcast, but I would tell you that traditionally we're trained, and I've been in business for many years. Traditionally, I was trained to manage all the risk, right? When the lawyers are trained, I was trained by the best and the brightest corporations, around, and I was trained to look at risk all the time. And actually, that risk melts away. And once we've been through the process, we often hear, gee, I don't know what we were thinking about. It's not so difficult now, right? It seems like this overwhelming behavior. So I would also suggest to our audience here, as they think about this, risk actually gets diminished through a more appropriate way to build the relationship and the governance model. And then some of the traditional behaviors that we fall back on in a contract are no longer necessary. And it's interesting, the transformation even within the folks as they go through this process, to see the difference in the contracting. Yeah, I would strongly mention that anyway, Kate, to build on what you've been saying, because we see it all the time.
I'll take that and take it one more step forward. Bonnie talked about the process. The process is very important because you're not just negotiating for the widget, right, for the transaction, but you're negotiating the relationship and the relational constructs. So you're bringing that into the buying process, right? It's not something you bolt on or do after the fact. So the contracting process, the relational contracting process, very, very important that you pull in these relational concepts as you're developing the relationship. And your contract simply is your manifestation of what you're doing. Yes, I'm buying the scope and the metrics and the money, right? There's those, right? The basics, but I'm bolting that on with the purpose of the relationship, the guiding principles, and the governance structure. So you have the process, the relational contracting process that yields a formal relational contract. So now when business happens, your contract, you just pull it out. It's not something you're afraid of. Oh my gosh, I have to pull out the contract. What's it say? It's your playbook. How do we actually address these changes? And what that does is it allows organizations to pivot very quickly. And that's what we found in, because we're kind of been obsessed lately, right? We've been doing these vested deals for a while and relational contracts for a while. So I've been going back to them during COVID and say, well, how'd you fare? What went well, what didn't go well? And they will tell you that they were able to pivot. And so if business happens and we need to pivot, you want a contract that's not a rigid document that is like, well, what are we obligated to do? No, business happened. What are we going to do? How do we manage this together? We're in a hole. How do you get out of the hole? And it's all that relational stuff. And those
and you bet there will be a hole, right? I mean, you bet there will be a hole, right? It's just life and business, right? Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting points. And you both have such great examples from organizations. And Kate, I'm glad to hear that you were able to find out that they were pivoting faster, because speed sometimes is so critical. Can you share some examples? And Bonnie, we'll start with you, and then Kate, of some companies that you've seen be successful in a more relational kind of approach with their key suppliers.
Oh, there's, I love it because it builds every year, right? And they're all different, and they're all in different industries, which makes it interesting as well. The one example I always think of right off the top, there's a couple of really interesting ones that I worked with. One was a pharmaceutical company who had a grand portfolio, and they went into a fully collaborative vested relationship contract with a provider of facilities and real estate. And as we talk about, business happens, right? So even though they've gone through this process, business to business, at a corporate level someplace in the world itself, corporation was looking at a strategy for how to either acquire, disband some of its businesses, sell off, whatever the case may be, because this is all happening at the same time. And in the absolute last hour, like 5 minutes before the deadline, the corporation of the pharmaceutical company sold off 27% of its footprint. 27%. Think about it. Like, more than a quarter of the footprint that they had just now spent all this time, right, business to business, figuring out how they were going to manage this. But the beauty of it was that because they had the relational contract and they had put these flexible conditions in the contract, the supplier, even though it looked like, holy cow, I've now lost 25% of the space that I'm now going to service, and I was banking on those base services for the income and all of this, the pricing model, the governance model, and the way they approached what their strategies were together actually allowed the supplier to be absolutely whole, absolutely achieve its financial expectations because the contract was structured. That's one of the ones I think of, right? That's pretty dramatic. We can all kind of get our heads around that. Another one was, which we constantly talk about, was actually professional labor. And Kate and I published a case study on this, and it's actually in public in Canada. And they were absolutely in litigation between the professional physicians and the hospital administration. They were actually in litigation. And we are now, I'm thinking 4 years, maybe post the contract signature, and they are happy. They are constantly managing the relationship. And oh, guess what? Yes, COVID hit them, their hospital system in British Columbia, And suddenly they were faced with an extraordinary workload shift, an extraordinary time constraint and all of this. And lo and behold, they used the vested decision-making process and their governance process to be able to restructure how they approach the patient load using their governance structure, and allowed them to be absolutely responsive very quickly to the patient load that was happening as a result of COVID. So we have a couple of cool sort of dramatic examples. I think those are dramatic, we can kind of relate to, and Kate has a gazillion. We always do, we always have more. And I'll defer Kate, come up with some more great ones because we have lots, which is terrific.
Yeah, I love the BC government hospital, the health authority and their doctors, the hospitalists. So Island Health is the case study, and it's a public case study for us. But literally we have copies of the newspapers when they were in litigation. They were in the news, right? And then COVID happens and they're in the news for innovating. So think about this, right? They sent me a note. They're like, we're making the front page of the paper. Like, health authorities and hospitalists innovate in time of crisis. How cool is that, right? And so you go from, this bad relationship to putting in the mechanisms of how you manage the business together, and this flexibility. You're buying the flexibility. You're just buying a billable line item. Show up and, insurance, right? And it's all these billable line items that you're bickering over. And said, you know what, we have to show up and do the billable line items, but it's much more than that. We have to have the relationships. We have to be able to know how to make decisions, what are our rules around transparency. And so by packaging the scope, metrics, and money and saying it's really about flexibility and packaging how you work, it's amazing how quickly you can pivot. Another example that we had was an insurance company in South Africa, right? And so they were able to take COVID and go, wow, what are we going to do different? And so they used it, and they used their transformation management processes that they built in to say, when we need change, how do we deal with it? So they already knew how they dealt with changes, how they made decisions. Triggers them, all of a sudden they're like rapid fire addressing all of these decisions because these mechanisms were part of what they were doing. And it's not just this nice thing to say outside of the contract, it's actually a contractual obligation. It's a formal relational contract. And so they know.
I'm sorry, Kate. I'm sorry. I was going to say, I was also going to mention that in the last two cases, those are government contracts, are they not? I mean, the Canadian BC Gov contract, Island Health, is a public government run contract because the health system in Canada is government run. So that's, we always get questions about, gee, does this work outside of commercial companies? And the answer is yes. Flat out, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, the insurance one is a public information, by the way, a wonderful case study. Discovery Health, they're the largest health insurer in South Africa. They have about over 50% of the market share, and it's an outsourcing relationship. So it is not government, but it's highly regulated environment. But it is a business. It's a nonprofit. So the insurance company is a nonprofit to a for-profit outsourcing deal who's managing their claims management administration of their insurance portfolio. And so, a very complex, large, huge, millions and millions of dollars going through that. It's the largest insurance provider by far. Over 50% of all insurance is run through Discovery Health in South Africa because they're so successful and so innovative. And they're embracing those and bringing in and saying, you know what, this is business. It's dynamic. We have to bring this in and address it front and center. So quit having rigid contracts, quit having this buy, sell, and put the relationship front and center. Right? I have a pharmaceutical one too, Bonnie. I just have to tell this one. It is so fun. We wrote about this one in an HBR article follow-up. So it was one of the companies who was making vaccines. Right? So all these pharmaceuticals, all this energy is put on the vaccines. Well, their headquarters and company offices are all closed. Everybody's working from home. So in a facility, if you're doing facilities management and all of a sudden you have all the facilities are closed, you've got this army of people. What do you do with your canteen employees? Don't need the canteen anymore, right? And so a lot of these were union workers. This was in Europe. A lot of unions can't really lay off these people. What do you do? And so they sat around and they were able to pivot and said, wow, all right, well, I'm doing these vaccines. I've got these canteen workers, can't really fire them in the short term. So how do we do this? So through their governance structure, they asked for ideas on how they could best utilize the labor. And they actually said, well, we should be servicing the people who are working 24/7 working vaccines. So they created literally like custom meal services. You're my vaccine people. What do you need? Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Do you need a take-home box? For the 4 hours you get to go home and see your family? So you can have a take-home dinner package. You can have cots. They put out cots, and so people could sleep, right? And gave them all the little, so they repurposed some of the facilities. And they said, look, we have people, you have needs, let's just pivot. That would have never happened in a rigid contract. No, we do the dining, we do, this is our scope of work. But instead of saying, you know what, we have people and you got a problem and here's our governance structure. And we if you have a cost structure that enables you to be flexible like that, you're able to pivot quite quickly. And it's very inspiring to see the ingenuity of how these people dealt with COVID.
Those are great examples. Thank you for sharing those. That's a really, talk about timely, the vaccine example. One thing I realized is I probably should have asked you to explain at the beginning of our conversation about the vested model and the sourcing business model continuum that we've discussed many times over the years, but just to make sure everyone understands what it is. And maybe Kate, could you also take a first pass at talking about how it can help drive this innovation that you were just describing?
Right. So Bonnie, I want to let you talk about sourcing business models. So you talk about the 7 models, and I'll take vested and specific and how it can drive change. So over to you, Bonnie. Talk about the 7 sourcing business models. We'll do a 1-2 punch on this one.
Sure. Okay. So 7 sourcing models. Let's just take a quick trip. We say that there's a continuum from a market buy side to a relationship and investment side. If you think about a continuum across a spectrum. And across that spectrum or continuum, we have at least defined 7 what we call sourcing business models, each having its own system of management and contracting. On one end, it's the tactical, basic supply item or service, plentiful in the market side, doesn't matter where you get it. I can get a number 2 pencil at the gas station, at the grocery store, and a supply, whatever, I can find one, right? I'm using a ridiculous example, but to drive the point home. And then we kind of down select and we say, well, we buy a lot of pencils, whatever we need. Let's just reduce the number of sources out there so I can leverage, right? Leverage keyword. You'll probably hear this in a lot of your sourcing solutions. I'm going to leverage my volume with fewer suppliers to get the best what? Price. Again, I'm getting a number 2 pencil. I just buy a lot of them. I'm going to get them. Well, at some point, that pencil now becomes less of just a leverage item. I actually need some more items in that same type of category, let's say from an office store, an office supply store. So I get my pencils, which I can kind of get anywhere, but I need some other things. I need paper, I need folders, I might need envelopes, even though we're a heavily digital world. And so I go ahead and I say, you know what? I really need access to more than just pencil supply. So not only am I going to down select the number of suppliers so I can leverage my price, because it's still transactional nature, but now I'm looking for somebody to give me more services. I want somebody who is maybe geographically located, can deliver to me within 24 hours. They may have some other value add. They may have an online ordering system I can just plug in. I can make this very easy. So we call that a preferred supplier. And then we say, well, wait a minute, all of this, I'm carrying the risk as a buyer. I really want to ship that risk to a supplier who's an expert kind of in their field. And I'm going to move this now to where it becomes performance-based. And I am going to look for an expert, so to speak, to manage all of these supplies and make a determination on my inventory, make a determination how I'm going to get this. They carry the risk. I still get a good price. And if they miss some of my targets, I can charge them a penalty. I might even consider gain sharing with them a little bit, but I'm going to have what we call a performance-based contract. And that takes us to what we say a fully collaborative contract, which is vested, and Kate will talk more about vested. But in vested, it is shared reward, shared risk, and we're looking for value generation. And when we talk about value, it's not dollars, it's value. Like Kate said, flexibility is seen as a value. There are lots of other values. And we're looking for transformation, innovation, and beyond. The other sourcing models that we talk about are shared services, because you could have, I'll call it a third party or shared services or a cooperative who is actually acting on your behalf. And so you have to have a contractual relationship with that entity. Again, we would recommend that it be collaborative, and certainly an equity or a subsidiary kind of partnership, which is a legal entity where you actually own. So that is at the furthest end of the continuum, because you now are an owner in that business model. So I'm going to divert now, Kate, to you after I took that quick trip across the continuum, and let you drill into vested, which is giving us the most benefit, the most collaboration and transformation and flexibility, right? Yeah.
So if I use like my imaginary little hand right on this continuum, so you got, as Bonnie said, the basic suppliers over here, and over here you've got a joint venture, right? Or an acquisition, you're investing, right? Well, in the middle, in economic theory, Oliver Williamson, who won the Nobel Prize, would call this a hybrid model. So it's not just a commodity, you're not just using market, you're using this hybrid. And so vested is a hybrid model. So best way to describe it is it's like a joint venture without a joint venture. So I'm still using the market, I'm still buying, but I need something a highly transparent way. I need to we need to be on the same team. And so this is where a lot of these deals have fallen down, and COVID has hit the spotlight on them, is your supplier wasn't on their same team, right? And so it's us versus them. And so one of our most popular blogs ever is the gorilla and the elephant. So if you were the gorilla and you had the hammer, you know, every dollar every year, and bid you out, bid you out, bid you out, it's all about the transaction. Well, supplier's the elephant. So COVID gave the power to the suppliers. There's only so much stuff going around, right? And so so they really had choices about who they wanted to work with, and where's the A team go? If you know, they only have so many A team people, who are going to solve the COVID problem and the supply chain shortages. And so that's what we want to do in vested, is we want to actually create that infrastructure. And I don't think infrastructure is a bad word really, because then you think, oh, it's, you know, but your relationship and the relational mechanisms. So when business happens, how do we pivot, right? If we don't know how we're going to do it in advance, you're probably not going to do a good job. You're going to be tripped up, right? And so vested is one of the 7 sourcing business models. It is not better than any others. If you're buying, Bonnie used the word pins, you can buy pins. You can have any of these 7, and they all work really well. But when you get to things that are more strategic, that are non-core competencies, so I need somebody to be the expert. It's not, you know, it's a strategic thing. I need to have these relationships, this hybrid type of relationship. Then vested is well suited. And so vested is a system. Think of it as an operating system of how you work with the supplier. So it is outcome based. So rule number 1, when you design a vested system with your supplier, outcomes versus transactions. I'm going to buy business outcomes. Rule number 2 is focus on the what, not the how, because if I contract for the spec today, it doesn't allow for the flexibility I need. So I like to use the analogy of Toyota. If anyone has ever worked at Toyota or known Toyota, they say the workers don't go to work to build a car. They go to work to build a better car and figure out how to make a better car. So it's not just about the work. It's about how I'm constantly looking at the work. So we want to put that mindset into a vested deal. Just like with the pharmaceutical. Yeah, your job was to be a canteen, but you know what? Today we got to do something different. Right? And so I can't be too contractually wedded with all the anal retentive metrics associated with the work, because then you get stuck in the present and that rigid part, right? So we want to be more flexible. Rule number 3 is clearly defined and measurable desired outcomes. So your metrics need to not just be transactional or SLAs, but they need to be boundary spanning business measures. So where's the business going and how do I keep at pace with the business, right? So P&G, for example, likes time to market. How do I speed market, right? So that would be a key thing that they want to work on with the suppliers. How do I be more responsive and get speed to market? And then rule number 4 is a pricing model with incentives that optimize the business. And this gives us the flexibility, because it's not just here's the widget, here's the price, right? And we're stuck on that. It's like, no, here's the cost. So if if gas quadruples, the cost of gas quadruples, and I'm doing something, I have to factor that in. So you can't just turn around and hose the supplier when something goes bad. Sorry, that was the price. So you're looking at the economics. So we think about these deals in terms of economics instead of price. And how do we have fair and equitable economics? We win together, we lose together. And then the last rule is insight versus oversight governance structure. So you're physically putting in these mechanisms to help you manage the business in a more flexible way, in a more proactive way, driving transformation initiatives or reacting to changes, right? And how do you make those decisions? So it is a system. All of the sourcing business models are system, but the vested model is an outcome-based system that uses a formal relational contract. If I'm on the basic end of the continuum, my system is hit the button and go to Amazon Business. You don't even need a contract, right? And so this is a key foundational difference in what we teach with sourcing business model theory, is it's not a tactic, it's not a best practice tactic, but you're actually creating a system that's appropriate for that type of supplier. And so some suppliers will be slotted as basic, some will be slotted as vested, and some might be a joint venture, right? And you're going to create or architect, as we like to say, the best fit solution for that supplier. And you don't need to have, 80,000. If P&G has 80,000 suppliers, they don't need 80,000 systems. But it's not just some tactics where you're using leverage. You're actually, as you shift across the continuum, you're bringing in value. Yes, down here, it's about price, but as I go up here, I'm bringing in those other value-based components, the governance components. My economics need to be flexible. The way I think about the work needs to be flexible. So I can't just write these contracts the way I would think that's a best practice, because it actually fails in these more complex deals.
And the excellent point. So thank you for elaborating on the vested model. And it actually brings us to a question from one of our attendees. And Federico has asked, are there detailed resources, articles, books, etc., on the subject of formal relational contracts in terms of both theory and case studies? So I'm not sure who to push that to first. Kate, okay.
She's got them memorized. She has them memorized, right? Yeah.
I got this one. So the answer is absolutely yes. So if you want to just think about formal relational contracts, we have a wonderful HBR article, and I think you were going to put the link into the, or one of the links into the
follow-up.
Follow-up resource. So the HBR article, really good, nice short clip, 4,000 words on it. We have a longer white paper. It is open source that we collaborated with the International Association of Commercial Management and Contracting. You can download that on our white paper. And Marisa, if you send me a note, I'm happy to put it, and you can do it in the follow-up link. It is open source. All of our white papers are open source. And then April 19th, or we hear it's April 19th, we'll see. The new book, Contracting in the New Economy, comes out, and it goes into the process that we teach. So we teach a 5-step process for developing a relational contract. And we give examples. Island Health is front and center all the way through. So we go through each of the steps. We show you how they did it. We show you other examples. And then in any of our vested case studies are all relational contracts. So you can pick up any of our case studies and see how they actually go into detail. We have about 20 case studies on our library, in our research library at vestedway.com. Just go to our research library. You can see all of our white papers, all of our case studies. And the book, Vested, How P&G, McDonald's, and Microsoft Are Redefining Winning in Business Relationships, is a great example of how they follow the rules, right? So these 5 rules of Vested. So wonderful research library. Everything you find in there is shareable. So download, have fun, put it on your, literally it's Creative Commons, so share it out. We just ask for attribution if you use it.
Okay, thank you. So actually, you mentioned a few other companies. I was wondering if you'd share a few more examples. You just mentioned McDonald's, for example. Can you share a little bit about what they've done in terms of relational contracts?
Yeah, so that's actually interesting. We have a formal case study on them. So they would use an informal relational contract. So we started our research in 2003. We started to look at these very successful relationships. What was working, what wasn't working, why, why were some more flexible? Why could some deal really easily with all these issues that would come up? And actually in the book, in the Vested book, talking about McDonald's, I think in the year we wrote it, they had 13 natural disasters. There was like cows floating in Australia. And there was in Japan, the earthquake that did the nuclear power plant. Do you remember that?
The tsunami.
Yeah. So they had 13 disasters. And so when the avian flu crisis hit, why does McDonald's not run out of chicken and everyone else do? When salmonella happens to tomatoes, why does McDonald's have tomatoes and no one else does? I was actually visiting Texas and no one had salsa. You go to a Mexican restaurant in Texas and you can't get salsa because they have a tomato shortage. I was like, well, how can I get tomatoes on my, at McDonald's, right? And so how they invested with their suppliers, right? And it's the suppliers bringing these innovations. And so absolutely fascinating. And people are shocked to learn that McDonald's doesn't actually have contracts with their most strategic suppliers. They have handshake deals. And that your eyes are bulging, right? No way, they don't have contracts. And so we're going, seriously, you have no contracts? Well, if we had contracts, we'd just be always out of date. We're always doing stuff. We're always innovating. And so they have what they call the system. And it's the mechanisms that they use to keep in continual alignment. They had a plan to win. They would, every 2 years, they get in alignment with their suppliers. So their most strategic suppliers, they actually purposely choose not to have contracts in order to get better business results. And they're always fair. So if you think about the guiding principles that we teach, McDonald's suppliers would say they're always fair. They're freaky fair, right? And so yet they have the lowest cost. How can McDonald's have 33 to 75% less cost structure than their competitors, right? Because their suppliers are making patents on their behalf. One of the patents, for example, we shared in the book was beef patty production. So a supplier developed how to double beef patty production and then shared it with the other suppliers. They have five suppliers who do beef. And so they said, hey, I've got this great patent, but you know what? They don't share that with their McDonald's competitors because they're inventing their transparency in what they do with McDonald's, those relationships, they're co-creating and inventing together to drive down. And this is why McDonald's has the #2 supply chain in the world. And not only do they have the #2 supply chain in the world, it's historically always been one of the best supply chains in the world. You know, if you go to the FDA and you say the Food and Drug Administration, who has the safest supply chain, hands down, they will say McDonald's. And so, but we were shocked that they didn't have contracts. And so we were like, this is that kind of risky. And so this began our journey to say, well, why can't you have your cake and eat it too? And you can have a formal relational contract. Why can't we bring in all these beautiful things in relationships and have a formal relationship? And that's where we started the process for that.
Make sure I'm not having audio trouble.
We can hear you this time. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks. So great example from McDonald's. Great example. So now that we're all thinking about lunch and patties and all, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, Bonnie, is the word resilient, right? It's been coming up quite a bit so far already in 2021. So with the benefit of hindsight, looking back at 2020, and also with the experience that you've had with relational contracts, what advice would you give to individuals and their organizations in terms of looking at 2021 and their strategic suppliers and how they can really structure these relationships to be resilient?
Oh my goodness. So again, every single one of the examples that Kate and I have given you around supplier reaction and response from the flexibility of a very collaborative and flexible contract has actually shown up in the resilience factor that everybody's kind of focused on today, right? And even if some companies did not have what we love as the vested contract framework in place, where we've seen some of this resilience raise its significance is when they were actually on the journey to getting to that collaborative environment, that they, in some cases, it was very intentional. In other cases, it just seemed logical to them for all the reasons, like McDonald's, when they said, hey, you know, why would we do that when we're going at warp speed here and we want to stay ahead of our competitors in the marketplace? So the most resilience that we've seen is a result of very strong and collaborative relationships, and relationships where flexibility is built in. And if Kate and I were, or any of the other folks who actually look at these formal contracts, if we were to look at the contracts, my guess is that we would see evidence that they were on the journey towards getting a very complete system. They weren't completely there, obviously, because they had some factors, but the fact that they had this relational component that was already starting to develop was actually what pulled many of these companies out of a slump that could have been extraordinarily damaging to that. I see it in clients today. It's interesting in the tech world, semiconductor world, for example. If you think about just that entity, everything we touch, you know, has semiconductors or chips or some sort of PC board or computer configuration. And think about where most of that is manufactured today. For those of you on this broadcast here, most of that is out of Asia. Well, guess where the flare-up came early in this pandemic, for example. And then that came to a screeching halt, and then the transport came to a screeching halt, and then the product feed and all of that started to come to a screeching halt because there was this absolute freeze on movement of goods, manufacturing of goods, and distribution of goods. And when I say goods, I'm talking about just the actual semiconductor or the component that had to feed into everything else that we use, right? That includes automotive, refrigerators, you name it, right? Whether we think about it or not, it runs our houses, right? The places that we live in. So where I saw the greatest resilience was when the relationship was already starting to head towards a vested relationship. They had an intent to move in that direction. They already had sound beginning, and somehow the distribution roadblock got broken not maybe as quickly as everyone around all of us on the phone would have loved, but it got broken and handled in a different way, because in that environment, the customer, the chip or semiconductor producer, actually relied on value, services, and capability of a supplier that they had never even contracted for. And the supplier said, well, yeah, you didn't contract for this, but guess what we can do for you? And out of that grew a sincere interest that said, holy cow, look at us. We can do something very transformative in innovation and so on going forward. And guess what? Here we are a year later, and they're flipping to a completely vested deal. So that was a real, I mean, that was close to home, right? I mean, it was China, right? Asia, and that was feeding us during this significant impact of supply. And it's made a big difference. And the case that Kate talked about with Even Island Health in British Columbia, resilience. Look at how that hospital went from perhaps which would have been an extreme roadblock to figuring out a way to be innovative and transformative. And that's what we mean by resilience, the ability to navigate these roadblocks, these hiccups, like McDonald's has, and using a system that is flexible and structured to provide benefit to both parties. That's how we see resilience raise its success. Yeah?
Yeah, I love what Bonnie just said. It's almost like a paradox. It's flexible and structured, right? So you have to have the structured mechanisms that actually enable the flexibility.
Yep.
Right, and that's the relational stuff, right? So we know, I mean, hundreds of research projects have been done around the relational aspects, and you have good trust and relationships, right? So why aren't we bringing it in? Why is it that we show you the hand, here's the contract? Why does the relationship stuff have to be separate? And then you get out of alignment. Your contract's actually out of alignment because everybody sticks it in a drawer. It should be your playbook. It should be your operational playbook. It doesn't have to be this enemy that you stick in a drawer. And that's what we're really promoting is plain language, you know, the structured system. So your contract becomes that playbook.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And we're getting comments from our audience saying, we love this concept of structured creativity. So well done, well done. Well, I really want to thank both of you for joining us today and sharing your thoughts on how you can really use your strategic supplier relationships to drive this better resilience and flexibility inside your organization. So thank you both again for joining us, Kate and Bonnie. And now we'll turn it over to Madison, and just a reminder to everyone that you will be receiving a recording and some of these resources that we've been discussing.
Awesome, thank you, Marisa. Yes, you should see on your screen some additional resources that will be provided in the follow-up email from today's webinar. And I just want to remind everyone, if you don't already, follow us on our social media accounts and connect with us to stay engaged. Thank you for joining, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Kate. Thank you, Bonnie.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.